Hello, everyone. Mr. Eford here with you guys again today. We're going to talk about Mesopotamia one last time. We have talked about all of the major people groups in Mesopotamia up until this point. We've looked at Sumer. We have looked at Acadia. We have looked at Assyria. We talked about Babylon last time. And so today we are going to wrap things up by talking about the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire is the last empire to exist in Mesopotamia. And once Persia is conquered by Greece, we're going to have to move on from Mesopotamia because as a civilization, it's just not going to exist anymore after the fall of Persia. Now, for my students at home, please make sure that you follow along and that you fill in the note sheet as you are going along. The note sheet will be linked below using a Kami document. I will also link a copy of the slideshow that we're going over today in class so that you can review that at your own pace. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started and learn what we can about the Persian Empire. So here we go. All right, we need to talk about Persia. Now, the Persian Empire exists for about 200 years, give or take. So 550 to 360 BC. That's when we're going to be looking at the rise and fall of the Persian Empire. The first Persian Empire took control of the Middle East after the fall of Babylon. Again, Babylon's kind of the key player until after Nebuchadnezzar II died, and then Babylon's weakened. Persia comes in and takes over. It is also called the Achaemenid Empire. So that's just another name for the Persian Empire. All right, here's a map of ancient Persia. And I'll go ahead and tell you guys, the Persian Empire is massive. It is much, much larger than any of the empires that we have seen in Mesopotamia so far. Akkadia's empire is one of the smaller ones. And then Assyria makes it a little bigger. And then Babylon conquers a little bit more. But Persia is huge. Persia takes over much, much more land than any of the other previous empires that we have looked at so far. We're going to talk about the size of Persia a little bit later on in the lesson. All right, here we go. The empire is founded by Cyrus the Great. Cyrus first conquered the Median Empire in 550 BC. And oftentimes you'll hear Persia referred to as the Medes and the Persian. The Median Empire is what is being referred to there. And then he went on to conquer the Lydians and the Babylonians. Under later kings, the empire would grow even larger to where it ruled all of Mesopotamia. Then it conquered Egypt and Israel and Turkey. In other words, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. This empire is massive. Its borders would eventually stretch over 3,000 miles from east to west, making it the largest empire on earth at the time. Now, just for comparison's sake, 3,000 miles, give or take, is about the distance from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast of the United States of America. So we're looking at an empire that is roughly the width of our country, the United States. That is huge. That is absolutely gigantic. Here we go, guys. Under Cyrus the Great, the Persians allowed the people that they conquered to continue their own lives and their culture, which is unique. This is not what any other empire has done before. The Persians come in and they tell the people, look, we're in charge, but you can continue to practice your religion. You can continue to have your customs. You can continue to speak your language as long as you pay taxes to the Persian king. And as long as you follow our laws, then you're good to live your lives just like you did before we came in. This is different from how every other conquered empire was treated before. When the Assyrians ruled, it was their way or the highway. The Persians are very different about how they treat the people who they've conquered and who they have made a part of their empire. All right, here we go. In order to maintain control of such a large empire, each area had their own ruler, and this person was called a satrap. The satraps acted like governors would, okay? They enforce the king's laws, and they make sure that taxes are collected. That's really their big job. Make sure that the people follow the law, make sure that the king gets his money, make sure that people are paying their taxes. There were around 20 to 30 satraps in the Persian Empire. All right, the empire is connected by roads. We talked about this with the Assyrian Empire, the Akkadian Empire. Roads are important. You can get messages back and forth between the different city-states and in the case of Persia, the different civilizations that were all under Persian control. But you could get messages back and forth. You can move troops to a new area relatively quickly. Roads are important. We see that Persia has its own postal system. They have a way of delivering messages back and forth to the different areas under their control. The most famous road, though, was the Royal Road, and it was built by King Darius, who was called Darius the Great. The road stretched around 1,700 miles. That's a pretty good distance. Stretched all the way from Sardis, which is in Turkey, to Susa, which was in the land of Elam. All right, although each culture was allowed to keep their own religion, the Persians followed a new teaching. They followed the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster. This religion was called Zoroastrianism, okay? And ism at the end of something just means a belief in. So they believed in the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster. And they believed in one God, one main God, who was called Ahura Mazda. Okay, now, if you move from the teachings before of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, all of them were polytheistic, which means that they believed in many gods and goddesses who controlled different aspects of nature. Zoroastrianism is interesting in that it is one of the first monotheistic religions that we have talked about. Monotheism is simply the belief in a single God, just one God rather than many gods and goddesses. All right, under King Darius, the Persians wanted to conquer the Greeks. And this is one of the big kind of battles in the world going on at the time. Who was going to be in charge, the Greeks or the Persians? He felt that the Greeks were causing rebellions with his empire. They were bucking the system. They weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So in 490 BC, Darius attacks the Greeks. He captured some of the Greek city-states. But when he attempted to take the city of Athens, which is at the heart of Greece, he was soundly defeated by the Athenians at a battle called the Battle of Marathon. And this is where something interesting happens, and I believe that probably this is more myth than truth. But apparently, after the battle had concluded and the Greeks had defeated the Persians, there was a Greek soldier whose name was Pheidippides, who was given the job of running back from Marathon to Athens to deliver the message that they had won. Now, that's a distance of about 25 miles. So Pheidippides, in full armor, goes running off as hard as he can, and he runs all the way from the city of Marathon to Athens. And he gets to Athens, and he shouts to the people. He delivers the message. In Greek, he says, "Ni Nike Kamen," which means we won. He shouts this out to the people, and then he promptly falls over and dies from exhaustion because he's run all this way in his armor. He's not stopped to get water. He's not stopped to rest. And of course, that story becomes legendary. Now people run marathons, which are standardized at 26 miles. We think that Pheidippides probably ran somewhere closer to 25 from the city of Marathon to Athens. But this is where we get the name marathon from for that race that takes place where runners are running that 26 miles. It's high endurance to get to the end of the marathon. But it comes from this battle between Darius and the Greeks of Athens. All right, here we go, guys. 480 BC, Darius's son, Xerxes I, attempts to finish what his father started and to conquer all of Greece. Where Darius had not been successful, Xerxes says, well, I can do what my dad couldn't do. He amasses a great army, hundreds of thousands of warriors. This is one of the largest armies that had ever been assembled during ancient times. He initially wins the Battle of Thermopylae against a much smaller army in Sparta. However, his navy, his ships were defeated by the Greek fleet in the Battle of Salamis, and he was eventually forced to retreat. So in both cases, when Persia tries to conquer Greece, Greece ends up winning, okay? Here we go. All right, the fall of the Persian Empire. All good things must come to an end, including Persia. Some of the things that caused the fall of the Persian Empire. Number one, kings became isolated from their people. They weren't listening to what the people needed or wanted. They focused on obtaining their own luxuries. In other words, they were more interested in amassing comforts and gold and just the nice things in the world for themselves rather than looking out of the interest of their people. And this all happens following the leadership of King Darius. So his sons, his grandsons, they become more interested in selfish things than in looking after their empire. There were struggles over the throne, which weakened the monarchy. You know, who's going to be the king? Who's going to be the next ruler? That weakens the throne. There were family problems within the royal family. Persia is a dynasty, just like some of these others that we've looked at before. And so rulership is supposed to be passed from father to son. but there were struggles within the family. As you know, you maybe have a brother or cousin who feels like that they're more apt or more fit to rule than the person who is supposed to take the throne. The Persian Empire is eventually conquered by the Greeks, and this happens under the leadership of Alexander the Great. Alexander is going to expand the Greek Empire to even larger than the Persian Empire. We're going to talk about that later on when we talk about Greece. But starting in the year 334 BC, Alexander the Great conquers the entire Persian Empire from Egypt all the way to the boundaries of India. So we're stretching from northern Africa all the way into the continent of Asia, and we're stretching a pretty good distance there at that point in time. So this is going to bring about the fall of the Persian Empire. All right, let's talk about a few interesting facts. The name Persian comes from the people's original tribal name, which was Parsua. This also was the name that was given the land that they originally settled, which was bounded by the Tigris River and the Persian Gulf. Okay, so that's where the name comes from. The longest reigning Persian king was Artaxerxes II, who ruled for 45 years. And we talked about average lifespans were a whole lot shorter then than they are now. So ruling for 45 years was a pretty big accomplishment. The years of his reign were from 404 to 358 BC. His reign was a time of peace. He wasn't conquering an empire. He wasn't building his empire up. He simply reigned during a time of peace and prosperity. When people aren't fighting, they can spend more time growing things and building things, making money. And so his period is a peaceful period in the Persian Empire. All right, the Persian culture held the truth in very high esteem. In fact, telling a lie was considered one of the most disgraceful things that a person could do. So honesty is the best policy in the Persian Empire. The capital of the empire was the great city of Persepolis. The name is actually Greek for Persian city, and that makes sense since it's at the heart of the Persian Empire. After Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, he allowed the Jewish people to return to Israel and to rebuild their temple. This is one of the big events that's discussed in the Old Testament of the Bible. And we'll talk about that when we talk more about the Israel and the Israelite culture later on as we talk about that civilization. All right, guys, that's all that we're going to cover with Persia. So the Persian Empire falls. We're going to move forward from Mesopotamia into some other civilizations from this point forward. I hope that you guys have learned something. I've enjoyed teaching you this lesson. For my students, please make sure that you are filling in your notes on your sheet and you submit those using the Cami tool. But until next time, we'll see you later. Take care.